So as long as we aren't perfect and we are free, we're going to disagree. And I think anybody who's had any experience really with any group of people of any size knows that's true. What happens when you bring people together is they disagree. That's permanent. But that doesn't mean that we can't be unified, because unity doesn't mean agreement. The opposite of hope is not pessimism. The opposite of hope is despair.
Yeah.
And I do think that despair is its own kind of sin. Citizens are on a journey together, and we're not enemies. We're not always friends, but that's just the wrong way to think about what the life of a free society involves. The most important office in the American system of government is not president, but citizen. There is no way the system works if we are not up to the job of being a citizen. And that job is demanding. It's not impossible. The presidency is impossible. But being a citizen is just demanding. We're up to it. We can do it. Both of our two major parties basically just say the reason to vote for me is because if the other guy wins, it'll be the end of the world. And I think rising out of that kind of muck and saying, no, the reason to vote for me is because I can offer a better future for you and your children. And let's have a debate about what that would look like. That does require us to lift our head out of the mud of this moment. And that is why I think people should get to know the past better, should get to know the potential better, the purposes better. It is, for me, about creating a deeper affection in that sense.
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. We have a particularly interesting guest today. His name is Dr. Yuval Levin. He's the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's founder and editor of National Affairs. He's a senior editor at The New Atlantist, a contributing editor at National Review, a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He's written numerous books, including The Great Debate, The Difference Between Burke and Paine, Fractured Republic, and A Time to Build. And then the book we talk about today is American Covenant, which is focused on the American Constitution. Our conversation focused on America, but it really was a conversation about how to live together. How can we live together with different ideas without demanding that we have unanimity of our opinions? And Yuval has thought deeply on this issue. What's fascinating to me is he is challenging the whole conservative movement to think beyond the reflex assumptions of being anti-government, patriotic, and pro-freedom. He's saying you also need to think about institutions. You also need to think about gratitude for these institutions and structures that we have that didn't just pop out of nowhere. And so he's very articulate on that. We had a long discussion about the nature of the people required for a constitution to work. You need, quote, a reasonably virtuous people, end quote. And so I tried to pin him down a few times. I tried to get him to take a position against Straussians or with the Straussians, but he is a very sophisticated and experienced guest. He has been asked these questions many, many times, and his ability to think on his feet certainly shows up, and it's a reflection of the work he's done on all his books. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Certainly learned a lot. We ended the conversation with a call to gratitude. He said, gratitude is an essential for a healthy country, and he worries about the degree of ingratitude that we have currently. So thanks again for stopping by. I look forward to hearing what you think. Dr. Levin, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And I was just saying before we started recording, I've been reading your books at least since 2014 when you wrote The Great Debate, which is a great book. Everybody needs to go out and buy that book. And I've been listening to your podcast. And one of my favorite quotes or stories that I tell everybody, because I thought it was so witty, you were on an interview and the host said, well, Dr. Levin, are you an optimist when it comes to America. And without hesitation, you said, I'm not an optimist, I'm a conservative. And I thought, he's thought about that before. And lo and behold, the first sentence in your book, The American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again, you open with this, quote, "This is a book about America, and therefore it is a hopeful book. If that seems like a strange leap of logic to you, then you are the right reader for this book," end quote. So what do you mean by hope?
Yeah, this is a great way to put the question, because what I mean by hope is almost in contrast to optimism. I think that optimism and pessimism are connected, twinned vices. They're wrong in the same sense, and that is that they both invite us to passivity. They say the future just is something, and maybe you think it's good, maybe you think that's bad. That's kind of a personality difference. But whatever it is. And I think that those are both invitations to passivity, and that passivity is maybe the characteristic civic vice of the 21st century. We all constantly run the risk of being passive observers rather than active participants in the lives of our society, even in our own lives in some ways. And in the middle between those virtues, between those vices, is a virtue, a demanding virtue called hope. And hope doesn't begin from the presumption that everything's going to be fine. It begins from the presumption that things could go well, that the resources are there, but that they will only go well if we act to make it so. And that's a morally freighted kind of potential for good that I think is how we ought to think about the future. And I am hopeful because the resources are there. The resources in America and around the West are there for the kind of renewal that I think we need, but the resources alone won't bring that renewal. And so I'm not an optimist because I think that human beings are not always very good at making the most of the resources available to us. We're prone to vice, we're prone to sin, we're prone to laziness, and all these things stand in our way. But I am hopeful because I think we can succeed if we overcome those. And how to do that is really the social and political question. But, giving up hope, the opposite of hope is not pessimism. The opposite of hope is despair.
Yeah.
And I do think that despair is its own kind of sin.
Yeah, I like that. Opposite of hope is despair. You said we suffer from passivity, and the thought immediately jumped to mind of all these peaceful protests we've seen over the last few years and burning cars and throwing bricks. So you're not talking about that kind of activism. You're talking about being some other kind of activism, I assume. So can you unpack that?
Yeah. There's certainly people willing to lash out in our society, but effective action requires real agency. And I think we're not very good at summoning agency in the 21st century. Oftentimes we think of social breakdown and dysfunction in terms of an excess of energy, people jumping in too soon, rushing too fast, the kind of classic breaking down of the success sequence. Sex too soon, kids too soon, not taking the time to build your life. That problem is obviously very real, but in the 21st century, we actually face a very different kind of social breakdown that I don't think we've even gotten very good at articulating yet, which is an unwillingness to jump in, to begin, to launch. A lot of the technologies of this era are technologies of passivity. They let us avoid engaging with people and getting things done without ever leaving the house and without making eye contact with anybody. And all the trends are toward passivity. Fertility is down, marriage is down, teenagers are driving less, they're partying less. Now look, there are good sides to this. Teen pregnancy is way down. Abortion is down, that's great. Divorce is down. But when divorce is down because marriage is down, when people basically are, young people in the United States are increasingly inclined to sit things out, to understand themselves as spectators and not actors in the story of their own life. And that kind of breakdown takes a different sort of response. And I think we're only beginning to wrap our heads around the challenges this poses. the just sitting in the basement waiting out life challenge, we're still not very good at dealing with that. And I think it's an enormous problem, in some ways a bigger, deeper problem than the other kind of excessive energy social breakdown. And, I would say the challenge of the coming years has a lot to do with agency, with figuring out how to be active. A lot of the frustration in our politics is a frustration at an absence of agency. Things just happen to us. These big forces somewhere else are driving things, and we don't seem to be in control. I think that drives a lot of populist reactions against elites in the West, and we've got to find better ways to figure it out, to think about it.
Yeah. When you said an unwillingness to jump in, the thought came to mind, an unwillingness to commit. We always want to have the receipt. Maybe we can return the item we purchased.
Absolutely right.
Yeah. So a big theme throughout your book, in fact, the last chapter of your book, you dive into defining unity. But I think the whole book is about unity. And you start out by saying we need to learn how to disagree better, not to disagree less. And again, that's a counterintuitive sense of what's going wrong. And I'm wondering if you could unpack that for us, unity.
Yeah, I think we recognize, certainly in the United States, we recognize that this is a moment of division. It's a time when we seem to be at each other's throats. And our politicians talk a lot about unity, but if you listen to them, what they tend to mean by unity is if everybody agreed with me, everything would be great. And that's true. I believe that too. If everybody agreed with me, everything would be great. But we should not expect that to happen. In a free society, that's not going to happen. And part of the beauty of the American system of government is that it's founded in an understanding of that reality. James Madison, who in a lot of ways is the father of the Constitution, says in Federalist 10, just very simply, he says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. So as long as we aren't perfect and we are free, we're going to disagree. And I think anybody who's had any experience really with any group of people of any size knows that's true. What happens when you bring people together is they disagree. That's permanent. But that doesn't mean that we can't be unified, because unity doesn't mean agreement. And that premise of the American Constitution is part of what the book really tries to bring out. Unity in the Madisonian conception doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the question of how can we act together when we don't think alike is really the political question. And I think the American Constitution, in a lot of ways, is an answer to that question, a set of answers that says you act together when you don't think alike by creating various mechanisms for competition, for negotiation, for accommodation, finding ways to build coalitions and arrive at action that most of us think is legitimate, even if none of us thinks it's perfect. That's very hard, but that is really the magic of democratic politics. And the various democratic systems around the world take different approaches to thinking about how to achieve that goal. But ultimately, the goal is legitimate collective action in a free society. It's very hard to do, and it's why the American system is so complicated, because it recognizes the complexity of that task, of that purpose, that empowering majorities and protecting minorities at the same time is very difficult, requires complicated balances, and the American Constitution, especially its most frustrating elements, the things that slow down majorities when they really want something, are all about achieving that goal. And so the book, in a sense, is a defense of that logic, because I think a lot of the contemporary criticisms of the Constitution are rooted in a forgetting of that problem and a neglecting of that logic.
Yeah. So as you were speaking, the thought came to mind that it seems like you're addressing something that critics of the current political moment accuse of being a major fault. And what I'm thinking of is this concept, or the reality of disagreement. So disagreement is a fact. Either we ignore it and pretend like we can have a neutral proceduralism that will just make everything okay, or we address it head on in a Carl Schmittian way and say we have friends and enemies. And so you're saying, no, we don't have to follow Schmitt and talk about friends and enemies, and the purpose of politics is to get in power so we can crush our enemies. You're saying, no, there's actually a better way. We actually work this out. Madison and company work this out in the Constitution, and they don't pretend like we don't have disagreements. And so in a way, you're emphasizing that fact of disagreements, strong disagreements, while also avoiding the friend-enemy distinction. Is that fair to say? Or
Yeah, absolutely. And it very much arises for me as a way of thinking out of that sort of critique. I think the notion that the domestic politics of a free society is a realm of friends and enemies is wrong. It is wrong, and it is ridiculous. It's also impractical, because ultimately enemies don't have anything to do with each other. They have only contestation and combat. But fellow citizens in a free society are going to live together. They're trying to figure out how to live together. They're trying to figure out what to do together. What should we do is the fundamental civic question. And both the we and the do matter there. It's not what should we think. We're not all going to think the same thing. It's what should we do? How should we address common problems that can only be addressed by common action? And that's not a question that you try to resolve with enemies. Aristotle says beautifully, enemies don't, not even enemies, he says strangers don't even want to go on a journey together. But citizens are on a journey together, and we're not enemies. We're not always friends, but that's just the wrong way to think about what the life of a free society involves. And so the question for us is, given that we do share a set of commitments and a national identity, but we don't agree about what to do together, how do we move forward? And that question demands that we think about the how, that we think about the processes involved in making decisions together that we're all going to think are legitimate. And I think in some ways the biggest mistake that the kind of post-liberal Schmittians today make is to think that procedure is neutral. And so they kind of dismiss liberalism as neutral proceduralism. But proceduralism, if you actually think about what moral formation is, and here again I follow Aristotle, I mean that's just, my work is just paraphrasing Aristotle in different contexts. But ultimately, moral formation involves the formation of habits, habituating people in the right ways of acting so that in moments of decision and crisis, we make the right choice almost as second nature because we're used to it, because that's who we are. So how do you form people? You form people by habituating people. How do you do that? You do it especially through procedure. That is, through the normal ways in which we resolve problems. We face a problem, what do? What's the kind of approach that people like us take? The answer to that question is given by procedure. And there's nothing less morally neutral than procedure. It matters enormously. And it's rooted in premises about the nature of the human person, so that liberal proceduralism begins from the assumption that we are all created equal. That's the reason why you can't coerce people. It's the reason why you have to find ways to work together, because no one has a right by nature to push anybody else around. And so the only legitimate way to make decisions is to do it through majority rule. Every other approach would be a kind of tyranny. And yet majority rule threatens to be very unjust. Majorities can be extremely unjust to minorities and to individuals. And so the big challenge is, how do you simultaneously advance majority rule and protect minority rights? That's the question to which liberalism is an answer. And it's not always a great answer, but different versions of it are better answers than others. And I think the American system offers us a kind of answer to that question that is unmatched, that has persisted for longer than any other in the contemporary world, and that is still of very great value to the kind of free society we have now. So I just couldn't be more opposed to the Schmittian way of thinking about the nature of a free society. And in a sense, this book is exactly an answer to the kind of challenge you pose. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad I found your button. I pressed your button. That was great.
That's it. That's it.
I was excited to hear that. So you've totally ruined the plan of my interview, Dr. Levin, and you've taken all the best questions. You've already answered them all. But I wanted to pick up on a few things you said. You mentioned Aristotle and friendship and the concept of civic friendship. One of my friends, Professor John von Hiking, he was at University of Lethbridge. He's just taken up a position in political philosophy at Arizona State. And so you'll see him writing things from there. But he's made that a focus of his work, the concept of friendship, but friendship in the civic sense. And so I'll ask you to dilate even, or perhaps you've already commented on that, and you don't need to say anything more. But I wanted you to comment on this problem that I've been wrestling with between universalism and particularism. And I worry, and it relates to your comments about unity. If we mistake the objective of living together as achieving universal truths that are true everywhere all the time in the particularities of government, then we end up in this contest of, like you said, winners and losers, as opposed to taking a higher level or a higher order view of things. So how do you sort out the difference between the universals and the particulars? Because that's another thing that comes up in the Schmittian crowd, where they say, well, it's about the particularities, about our founding, and that's what we're defending, as opposed to this universal approach to government as a procedure. So have you wrapped your mind around this tension?
Well, let me try with you. I think that that distinction is more of a problem for theory than for practice. And here I'm just a Burkean. I think that theory is only useful when it describes practice properly. And if you have a theory that says that the nation you've been living in for 250 years as a society is impossible, then it's probably not a very good theory. And so I think the question for us is, how do you draw the distinction between the universal and the particular as a practical matter? I think the United States is a reasonably good answer to that kind of question. We are a particular society, right? We are a nation with a history. The nation consists of actual people, your actual neighbors, who have actual needs and wants and priorities, and who we actually have to take seriously. That matters more than the ideas, and it would be a mistake to think otherwise. And we have a particular history in common with victories and defeats and triumphs and tragedies, and that shapes us in very profound ways. But at the core of that common history and at the beginnings of our national story is a commitment to a set of ideas. Part of what distinguishes the United States, because every nation has a history, our particular history is distinct, among other reasons, because it begins with a commitment to a set of ideas. And the chief idea, and here I think Lincoln is just right, the chief idea is that we are all created equal. That idea is not obvious. I don't entirely follow Jefferson in thinking that it's self-evident. I think we have to constantly prove it to ourselves, but it is true. And the politics of a society that begins from that premise is going to be a politics that recognizes the equal dignity of different people, is going to be a politics that ultimately follows some form of democratic practice. And our particular liberal democracy is also rooted in a commitment to Republican ideals. That is, to the idea that we own this society. Its problems are our problems. Its achievements are our achievements. And so it's up to us as citizens to think through how to address its public problems. When you think about it that way, I don't think the tension between the universal and the particular is all that complicated. This is our nation. It's not everybody's nation. That's true. And there are boundaries on who Americans are. There are commitments that define us. There's a national culture. I think Americans too easily forget that we have a national character, that we think we're so divided. What do I, as a conservative living in Washington possibly have in common with some radical progressive in San Francisco? Well, the answer is a lot. And if you spend 2 weeks outside the United States and then run into that guy somewhere, you will immediately recognize a fellow American, let me tell you. And everybody else will too. And so the idea that we just don't have a lot in common is just nonsense. We have a lot in common, and there is such a thing in the world as an American. But among the things we have in common is a view that we're all equal, that no one gets to push us around, that we don't look up to aristocrats here. That's not what we do. And so I think the universal is part of our particularity. That commitment is part of who we are. And the tension between them is a much bigger problem for political philosophers who want everything to be tidy than it is for citizens who want to live in a free society.
Yeah, there's a great line, and I don't have it at my fingertips, but you say this book is not written for the political pundits and philosophers who want to get everything theoretically right. But
theory it has to explain the world, so it's going to be a mess. That's fine. I mentioned Burke before. Burke says theories arise from practice. They do not produce practice. And I think that's very, very important to remember.
Yeah, and I forget if it was Warren Buffett or some economist, a financial type, said that, your idea works in practice, but it'll never work in theory.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right. So you've mentioned it a few times. You've said it starts from an assumption about what we think about humans. So really, it starts from an anthropology. And this was one of the questions I was going to ask you. Bottom of page 82, you talk about the heart of modern republicanism is the idea that the human being and the citizen is rooted in the highest traditions of the West. And you explain it as you have here just now. And then on page 83, you have this line, quote, "A defense of constitutionalism in America is inherently a defense of this Republican anthropology, while hostility to constitutionalism is often rooted in hostility to this view of the human person and the nature of society," end quote. And first of all, I thought it was brilliant. In fact, I suspect you're a Straussian, and so I started seeing, is this the sentence in the center of the book? Is he doing esoteric writing or something? I marked it all up and, exclamation mark. You're asking people for a lot of unanimity on that fundamental assumption of anthropology. And I agree heartily with you. I think anthropology and epistemology, our ideas about humans and our ideas about knowledge, are at the core of our political debates, and we need to talk about them more. Are you asking too much? Asking Americans to agree on this fundamental anthropology? Because even on the non-left, we have fundamental disagreements about humans. Maybe humans, Rousseau's quote, "Every man is born free. Man is born free, but everywhere finds himself in chains." And you've mentioned the word liberalism a number of times. So do you are you speaking for yourself? Are you speaking for Burke? Or are you hoping the rest of American conservatives will agree with you on your anthropological statements? So is this aspirational or is it propositional? What are your thoughts on
this is a great question. I can't avoid saying a word about Strauss because you mentioned him in your question. And I am, in a way, something of a Straussian. I learned how to write something as long as a book from a teacher of mine named Ralph Lerner at the University of Chicago, who is very much a Straussian, who told me that it's just easier to write a book if you think about it as organized around a central concept. And so this book, and this is true of all of the books that I've written, does have absolutely a central chapter. It has an odd number of chapters, and there's a middle one, and it's the middle for a reason. And the middle of this book is the chapter about Congress, because I think that really is the heart of the story. I'm not that much of a Straussian that there's a middle sentence. That really would take a lot of work. But certainly the point you describe is key. And I think that it is both aspirational and propositional in the sense that the proposition at the core of the American experiment is one that we need to persuade ourselves of in every generation. And I think the fact that Lincoln describes it as a proposition, that he declines to use Jefferson's term of self-evident truth and describes it instead as a proposition, is a deep insight, actually. And it is a proposition. We have to come to believe it. And certainly part of my purpose in writing is to try to persuade people that it is true. And what is true is not just that we're all created equal. I do think that is true, and that's vital to know, and that's something that classical political philosophy didn't know. Aristotle didn't know that we were all created equal. We learn that from the Bible. We learn that from the other side of our civilization. But it's not just that. There is also a kind of Republican anthropology that takes people seriously, that says we're capable of self-government, we're capable of difficult things, but we're also awfully prone to fail in our attempts to be good people. And that means we need institutions that will form us in the direction of virtue and republicanism. And sustaining those institutions is a core purpose of our politics. That's the sense in which I'm a conservative. I think conserving those formative institutions is the essence of public life and social life. Obviously, that is not everybody's opinion. And in that sense, my work it tries to be persuasive work. It's argumentative work. It doesn't simply describe things we all agree about. But I do think that it describes something that is at the essence of our political life. And that ultimately, if we're going to sustain what's good about our society, we have to begin from that premise. So that's an argument. That's certainly not everybody's opinion. And I think we'll be stronger the more we believe that, and that the more of us believe that. That doesn't mean that we all have to agree about everything in order for our society to function. This is a kind of prerequisite for functional politics. But part of the beauty of our system and part of the logic of having a written constitution, for example, is that it allows us to separate the form from the substance of political debates. We can have some agreement about how our politics should work, and that makes room for a lot of disagreement about what our politics should do. I think that's true in every society, but that it's especially clear in American public life because we have a written constitution that is all about the how more than the what. And I do think that at the center of that is an anthropology. There's no getting around it. I don't believe that we're all born free and everywhere in chains. I'm more on the Book of Job side of that says man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. I think Rousseau was answering that in saying man's born free and is everywhere in chains.
Yeah.
But no, we're not everywhere in chains. The institutions don't enchain us. The institutions form us to be free. That is, I think, a core difference between left and right, and I'm on the right. That's where I start.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, that was another hot button for you, so that's great. I'm glad I'm finding your buttons. This is really good. You mentioned Congress. We're going to go there in a second. I have a quote I want to read there. But before we leave the anthropology comment, I like that you're saying this is a point that you're trying to persuade people, because I think this is a point that needs persuasion amongst the non-left. We're not even trying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so there's work to be done there. And you also have a comment I wrote down on page 76. You refer to the need for a, quote, reasonably virtuous people, end quote. And you talk about shame at one point and how we can actually denigrate our institutions by behaving poorly. I wonder if you could dilate on that, again, with a sense of the raw material that's necessary for a constitution to even work. We need to have a certain kind of anthropology, and we need a certain kind of character or decency, shall we say, for this to work. And I wonder if you could dilate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a way of thinking about the American system, and sometimes even a way of reading the words of the framers of the Constitution, that sees the system kind of mechanistically, that says it's here so that we don't have to be good. It just sets people against each other, and by the fact of their being restrained by one another's power, they can't really do all that much harm. There's some truth to that, and there are even moments when Madison talks that way. But that's not, I think, the deepest truth of our system. And Madison saw that too. Ultimately, we do this kind of government does require some basic foundation of virtue, that old-fashioned idea, in the citizenry. The most important office in the American system of government is not president, but citizen. There is no way the system works if we are not up to the job of being a citizen. And that job is demanding. It's not impossible. The presidency is impossible. But being a citizen is just demanding. We're up to it. We can do it. But it does take a recognition of what it requires. It takes a certain amount of responsibility, a sense of ownership, a willingness to say this is our country and its problems are our problems, a willingness to make some concessions and accommodations to live together with each other. Ultimately, all of that requires a modicum of virtue. And so, yeah, I would say reasonably virtuous. It's not, we don't all have to be saints. That's not going to work. But we can't all be just despicable fools. That's not going to work either. And so I think that does require us to have some understanding of our system of government. It does require us to have some responsibility. That's a very American word, responsibility. It's you know, it used to be the case that the Oxford English Dictionary actually said that the first appearance of responsibility was in the Federalist Papers.
Wow.
And very unfortunately for me, they found an earlier example of it in English, in England about 30 years before. But it is nonetheless the case that the Federalist uses the word responsibility an awful lot. And it was not a word in common usage. They almost had to coin it to describe what they were doing. And the role of the citizen does require that. It is demanding of us. But, you know, those are demands we can meet. And as long as we recognize that, I do think the system can endure.
Yeah, brilliant answer. So I wanted to ask, just before the show, I was reflecting on your work, your body of work. You wrote a great book on Burke versus Paine, the great debate. You've mentioned Burke a few times. You've mentioned Britain. You've written a book called The Fractured Republic, A Time to Build, talking about institutions, the need to rebuild institutions. You've been persuasive on anthropology. So it seems like you're a bit of a radical in a sense on the conservative side of things. You're asking us to really embrace things that don't come naturally for conservatives. And to that end, I happened to pick up this book off my shelf just before the interview. It's called The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America, written by two Brits, Micklethwaite and Woolridge, editors at The Economist. This is from 20 years ago. And they list 6 Burkean principles. They say it's kind of a crude summary. And they say you can think of American conservatives as being really bullish on the first 3 and really bearish on the second 3. They don't really care about the second 3. You know, they have bumper stickers that say, I love my country, but I hate my government. Or, you know, we need a small enough government that we could drown it in a bathtub. And it seems to me that a lot of your work is emphasizing one of those principles that traditionally conservatives in America don't emphasize. And so just very quickly, the principles, the first 3 are: number 1, a deep suspicion of the power of the state; number 2, preference for liberty over equality; number 3, patriotism. So I think most people would agree, yeah, conservatives own those 3. But the next 3 Burkean principles: number 4, a belief in established institutions and hierarchies; number 5, skepticism about the idea of progress; and number 6, elitism. Now, you already made a comment about elites and aristocrats, so you don't support that. So check, yes, you're an American conservatism. You're American conservative. But Dr. Levin, a lot of your work is about institutions and structures and being formed by them. And that is point number 4 on their list. That falls outside of the American conservative mainstream, shall we say. So your work has been very well received. I hear it quoted all the time. And yet, are people aware that you're really trying to nudge conservatism in a particular direction to embrace something that hasn't been part of the fabric or the DNA of the movement? Is that fair to say, or has that been your sense?
Yeah, I really like this question. It makes me think in Burkean terms of the very, very end of Burke's reflections on the revolution in France. The last paragraph, Burke describes himself as, but with a metaphor of a man on a ship in a storm who is always running to the opposite end of the one the ship is threatening to lean into. So to keep it from toppling over, he moves his weight to the opposite end. I think that's what he was doing, and I think there are some ways in which my kind of conservatism tries to do that too, and to do it for the American right. That is, I think those 6 principles are a pretty good description of a Burkean conservative. Especially if you expand a little bit on elitism. Elitism is a tough concept to defend, but I think the idea that we need an elite worthy of its privileges is right. We're going to have an elite. Every society does. The question is, do we have a worthy elite? And that is a challenge that conservatives think about, and it's one that I think about too. I think we are living in a moment when American conservatives, as you say, emphasize the first of those 3, very much reject or ignore the second of the 3. And so, yeah, in this moment, I emphasize those other 3, no question about it. The ways in which we are insufficiently conservative now have to do with our failure to emphasize the importance of institutions, our failure to emphasize the importance of social order, and in that sense also our failure to think about what it would take to have a worthy and legitimate elite. We almost think that's impossible, that's a contradiction in terms. These are ways in which the right in America has become more populist than conservative. And conservatives are just a faction of the right. We don't own the right. For a lot of my adult life, it was possible to think that conservatives just are the right, that the Republican Party, for example, in America, is just a conservative party. There was a moment in 2015 when he was running for president where Donald Trump was asked something about how what he's proposing to do is not conservative. And he said, this is not the conservative party, this is the Republican Party. And I thought, that is a very interesting thing to say. It's stuck with me now for 10 years because it's true. And conservatives have to understand ourselves as a faction within the American right. And what we offer the right is a corrective to the excesses of populism. The right as a whole is a corrective to the excesses of the left. That's very necessary. But within the right, there are tendencies to excess, which I think we see on display now. In a rejection of the possibility of authority, a rejection of the need for institutions, and those all risk everything that the right has to offer. And so I think in this moment in particular, conservatives in America need to be reminded of those elements of conservatism that we tend to underplay or dismiss or even reject. And at the very center of that is a defense of society's core institutions. The institutions that form people in the direction of virtue. We are not paying enough attention to those. And so a lot of my work over the last 10 years or so has been about that.
Brilliant answer. Tied to that list, at number 5, they talk about a skepticism of progress is a Burkean concept. And yet America, Canada too, we're all about growth, economy, wealth, progress. In your book, you talk about progressivism and the progressives' response to the Constitution as being an insufficient structure or break on industrialization, differences in society. Where does your mind go vis-a-vis progress? Are you saying maybe we shouldn't be so bullish on progress? But then now you're sounding like a progressive and saying, well, I just finished criticizing the progressives' attack on the Constitution. So how do you square that circle, progress, progressivism, and the Constitution?
I think the question is progress in what domain? I'm a big believer in material progress. I think we can make real progress economically, scientifically. These are areas where we will know more tomorrow than we do today, and where there's every reason to think that we will have more abundance tomorrow than we do today. I do not think that we are likely to make much progress in fundamental moral terms in the West. I think we have arrived at certain truths which are final, and the only thing we could do now is forget them, and we shouldn't do that because that would be very dangerous. A lot of our politics is about whether we should forget those truths or hang on to them, and I'm on the hang on to them side. So, we occasionally make progress at the margins in these places, but from the moment when St. Thomas finished combining Christianity and Aristotle, have we made a lot of moral progress? Not a lot. No. I think that a lot of what there was to know is known in that combination. In that combination of Jewish and Christian insights with a Greek understanding of the nature of society, you have a lot of truth right there. And sure, we've learned some things since then. We've applied them. We're a much better civilization now in the way that we treat minorities, in the way that we think about the nature of human dignity. But the idea that we require a new kind of human being and that politics could achieve that is the characteristic mistake of modern political life. And I think it has done almost only harm. And boy, it has done a lot of harm. And a lot of what conservatives offer a developed society of the West is resistance to that notion and a reminding of the basic fundamental truths that every generation has to know. A reminding of the fact that every generation has to know it, that we all begin in the place our parents began, not in the place where they left off. So that the education we need is the same education they needed, and the same education everyone has needed if they're going to have any chance of being a genuinely virtuous person. That does make me a kind of radically conservative person. There's no question about that. And I am skeptical of the possibility of transformative social progress in that way, because I think human beings are improved soul by soul, not society by society. Politics can't be a shortcut to moral improvement. We each have to do it ourselves by encountering those fundamental truths and letting them shape us. And in that sense, I think that's about as conservative as you can get.
Yeah, that's a great soliloquy. That's awesome. So when you started with that, you said, we've arrived. And I thought, oh, no, is this a Hegelian? He's saying history has ended.
It sure isn't. No.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm really glad you expanded on that. I thought I was going to hear a speech about the arc of history. And now...
look, there is no arc. That's the whole problem. We are always at the beginning. We are not in a different chapter.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, there is no arc. Might have to clip that as a short. Now, before we leave this, though, one of the tenets, the core tenets of modern liberalism, classical liberalism even, and a lot of people will reference John Gray's work, British philosopher, wrote about the four pillars of liberal thinking, political liberal thinking. But one of the concepts there is meliorism, or this idea that we can improve on our structures, we can improve our politics. And so you've used the word liberalism a few times, and you're saying, American liberalism. And then here you've just taken an axe and chopped down the pillar of meliorism, the concept that we can improve upon our political structures. And you say, no, we arrived, many hundreds of years ago.
Well, I don't actually agree with that. I think we can improve on our political structures. I think of those more as, I think of that kind of progress much more as material progress than moral progress. I don't think politics is the most fundamental way in which we live our moral life. And we definitely have made progress. The American system was an advance on anything that came before it, and we have made some advances on that original system too. And a lot of other societies have improved their institutions over time in ways that constitute genuine improvements. But those are genuine improvements when they are in the direction of the durable truths of the human condition, when they embody a greater recognition of what doesn't change. And so I do think we can gradually improve in that direction. We can also gradually move in the opposite direction and make our system worse, and we've done a little bit of that too. So political change certainly is possible, and institutional change is possible. Sometimes it's necessary, but all of that change happens in an effort to align our political, practical lives with those enduring moral truths. And we don't know those truths perfectly. We often don't know them directly. We learn them through trial and error. And that means that sometimes we improve and sometimes we fall back. Again, there's not an arc. We can move in both directions. We've got to be careful.
Yeah. So I thought I had you pinned against the ropes there for a second, Dr. Levin, but you're too good at answering these questions. So the chapter in the center of your book, I said we needed to come back to it about Congress, and this is page 136. You say this, quote, representatives in a legislature can refine and elevate public sentiments and passions and give them forms that are more amenable to negotiated accommodations so that they might be turned into coherent governing objectives, end quote. I wonder if you could expand on your thinking there. It sounds like we're asking a group of elites to shape the way we think. And what jumps to mind is the common good. And we're hearing a lot of debate about, well, we need to push a common good versus the common good being a set of procedures or structures that we all participate in. Is it a contentful, crisp description of a good that we should enforce? And I don't think that's what you have in mind, but I wonder if you could unravel that tension and vis-a-vis your statement about refining and elevating public sentiment and passions.
Yeah, so refine and elevate is Madison's term, and I think that it's important to see a couple of points. First of all, these are representative elites. They've been chosen to represent some faction of society in a legislative process, the purpose of which is bargaining and accommodation. The question is, this is a very diverse society, how do we arrive at modes of common action? The answer offered by the American system, offered by every modern democracy, is it can't be done directly. Madison has this line that even if every Athenian had been a Socrates, the assembly would still have been a mob. And the reason is essentially that if everybody is participating directly in government, it's just going to be mayhem. And so there has to be some system of representation where the people who actually make the decision do it on behalf of portions of the public they represent, but do it with one another. It is an elite process, no way around that. And it's an elite process that's meant to mitigate the excesses of democracy while advancing the virtues of democracy. And that happens by structured negotiation. The legislature is a mechanism for structuring negotiation. And the structure makes possible things that would not be possible for the society as a whole, so that the people's representatives can arrive at agreements and arrangements that the people they represent could not have arrived at. They're sitting in a room together, they get to know each other, they have some things in common even though they represent very different views, and the purpose of their work is accommodation. I think that's very important. It is a republican system in Madison's sense and not simply a democracy. And that balancing of, in a sense, elitism and populism is essential to the way in which the system can work. And what they're arguing about is substantive. It's not procedural. They're arguing about what the law should be. That's certainly a question that is very morally freighted. And society makes decisions about those kinds of things. But those decisions are structured by procedures. And so the way in which the structure and the process interact, the way in which the substance and the procedure interact, is that the procedure creates a way to arrive at a substantive decision that will be viewed as legitimate by as many people as possible. I think that's basically the logic of American legislative politics. And it's why the legislative branch is at the heart of our system. It's why it is the first branch.
Yeah. And on the assumption of Chapter 3 that you have a reasonably virtuous people. So hopefully you have decent people in the room. I wanted to, we're getting down to close to the end. And so this is probably one of my almost last questions. I wanted to you mentioned sentiment. We just mentioned Congress, sentiment. And the word that I had written down was affections. One of my favorite speeches from the Canadian founding discussions before Canada was, this is 1865, so Canada started 1867. John Sanborn was talking about a constitution. He said, whatever it is, it must be, quote, planted deep in the affections of the people, end quote. And he said it must be in the hearts of the people. He said, why did the English Constitution last for so long? He said it's because the people connected it with a great chain had been conquered by resistance to oppression, by sacrifices of blood, by resistance to royal exactions and assumptions. And these achievements were preserved, held dear, understood, valued, and clung to with all the tenacity of that great people's nature. And so how do we instill or reawaken that affection? Because if we simply have a structure, the neutral proceduralism again that we talked about earlier, versus having people get to a point, they can read your book and say, yeah, okay, that makes total sense. And hopefully they'll walk away with a love for it. But love and affection for a institution, a hierarchy, right? This is the summation of many of your books.
Yep.
How do we reawaken an affection? So have you turned your mind to that? You're appealing to the head, absolutely, with this book. And while you're thinking about that, on one of the last pages in your book, 298 and 99, you talk about getting your own citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
And you were expecting the judge to say something profound and quote Lincoln and quote, instead, he told us that from that day on, we should think about America in the first person plural, in terms of we and our, and not them and their. That was it, quote. And so I'm wondering if that, I'll let you answer.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on affection?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of where I was going. I mean, I would say there is a way of talking about these questions that can be too cold and rational, and it's important to be rational, and it's important to think in organized ways about these subjects. But ultimately, there has to be some degree of just affection and commitment and identity for a society to function. I would say that in my experience, in the American experience as I have lived it, there's always a lot of worry about the decline, the collapse of national affection and love of country. And yet the United States is just a wildly patriotic society. I mean, the flag is everywhere. Everybody on all sides says they're fighting for the Constitution. And for all that we complain about it, I think really compared to most other free societies in the world, the United States is just insanely, madly patriotic. It isn't really the problem we have. And I think there is a challenge to fill that patriotism with some substance, with some knowledge of history, which we certainly lack, like everybody else does, and with some knowledge of core principles. I also think that there's a way that people always think that the country they love is the America of the past and not of the present. And so there was some golden age that we've lost and we have to recover. And it's funny, but left and right actually both think this way about the United States. And I don't really think that way. I love this country. I certainly love the American founders, and I think the history is wonderful. But I actually think contemporary America is awesome. And this sets me apart, I think, from just about everybody I know in the United States. But it is, I think, ultimately, it's vital to draw a connection between those affections and the substantive commitments that they're rooted in. You can't love your country unless it's lovely. That's surely true. But you also shouldn't love your country just because it is your country. You should know why it's worth your loving. And that requires a kind of substantive civic education that I do think is lacking some, and that requires some commitment. So the idea that we need greater common affection certainly is important in a divided society where there is a lot of us and them. There's a lot of sort of the other side is all these terrible things. But, most Americans don't really fit either side's description of its opponent. Most people aren't really in that right or in that left that the right and left talk about. And in a sense, what they require is a politics that calls upon their best, that calls upon their better angels. Our politics is not doing that now. It's in a very degraded place where both of our two major parties basically just say the reason to vote for me is because if the other guy wins, it'll be the end of the world. And I think rising out of that kind of muck and saying, no, the reason to vote for me is because I can offer a better future for you and your children. And let's have a debate about what that would look like. That does require us to lift our head out of the mud of this moment. And that is why I think people should get to know the past better, should get to know the potential better, the purposes better. It is, for me, about creating a deeper affection in that sense.
Yeah, brilliant. So when you said America is great right now, I smiled so much my earbuds pretty much fell out of my ear.
Look, it's got a lot of problems, sure, but I mean, when would you rather live, really? And this isn't just true for Americans. I think this is true in every functional modern democracy.
Yeah.
And yeah, every one of them thinks it's not functional, but I mean, please. And every one of them thinks things used to be better in the 1950s, but that's not true.
Yeah.
We really have to get over that kind of baby boomer nostalgia for the post-World War II.
Yeah.
That's just not right. That is leading us down a lot of very, very bad paths.
Yeah. No, I was smiling not because I disagreed, but I just was smiling that you said it so strongly. That was fantastic. So last question. I mean, we could end it right there, but I always ask a guest, what have I missed, either in your book or where your head is at right now? What's keeping you awake at night? What do you think we should be talking about more that we're not talking about? And you've said many things that we should be thinking about. If you don't have a formed answer to this, that's okay. But I'm just wondering, where have we completely missed the boat on this interview or in the conservative movement in general right now in America?
Well, look, I guess I think if there's a theme we haven't really touched on that's important to me, it's the danger of ingratitude. And we have touched on it. It's a lot of what we've talked about, but I think it's worth putting in those terms. I think in a sense, our greatest civic vice is ingratitude. It's just not starting from a sense that what we have is better than what most human beings have been able to expect in any time and place before. And that doesn't mean our problems aren't real. They're very real, and they demand our attention, and they're going to take a lot of work and be very hard to deal with. But let's begin from the fact that we are very, very fortunate to be where and when we are. And if we do begin from that fact, I think we'll also be better at taking care of the future.
Brilliant. Yuval, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.